thank you to Francis and Michelle for organising this event. I was delighted when Francis called me to say that they were planning such an event, and it's an especial pleasure for me to be here with Anne and with Norman. Anne is a campaign against arms trade, which in my opinion is probably one of the most effective organizations working against the arms trade anywhere in the world. Anne, thank you very much. Anne contacted me within weeks of my arriving in this country, having been forced out of Parliament in South Africa for reasons that will become clear in a moment. And Norman, as is clear from his brief remarks, is one of the few MPs, I think perhaps yourself and Claire, who have really taken up this issue. And it is an issue that is of extreme importance to us, not only in terms of the obvious manifestations of the consequences of weapons, but in terms of the consequences for our own democracy and the democracies in those countries we sell to. It's also great for me that both Norman and Anne feature prominently in the book, which is called The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade. And I interviewed both of them while I was researching the book a few years ago, and a film based on the book, a full-length documentary, will come out early next year.
The film company hasn't been in touch.
You were in government at the time. We thought it would be inappropriate for us to harass you while in government, so we got Claire instead. Just to give you some sort of context for what we're talking about. Global military expenditure is estimated to have totaled $1.75 trillion in 2014. That's $250 for every person on the planet. The small arms trade is surprisingly small in terms of its monetary value, $8.5 billion a year on average, but around 5 million firearms are sold in a year and are responsible for around 526,000 violent deaths every year in warfare and murder. Now, obviously, the arms trade is an important dimension of national defense, a tool of foreign policy, including, it must be said, covert foreign policy. Think back to the Iran-Contra deal, which wasn't a lot more than a very elaborate and criminal arms deal. It is a contributor, albeit massively overstated, to the economy, but the trade has additional profound impacts, from the enabling, fueling, and perpetuation of conflict and repression to the corrosion of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. It's important to be aware of the reality that arms deals stretch across what I describe as a continuum of legality. On the one hand are what are seen as the legal deals, the formal market, between states and large, often listed, sometimes state-owned companies. To the other extreme, which is known as the black market in arms, deals that are completely illegal in conception and implementation. But the reality is, in 15 years of investigating this industry, I have yet to come across an arms deal that does not contain some element of illegality. So the vast, vast majority of arms deals, whether they're done by states, big corporations, tiny individual corporations, or individual arms dealers, tend to be in what is called the grey market, the shadow world, where there are a combination of legal and illegal. What is crucial to these transactions are the intermediaries, people you will know as arms dealers. They're also known as agents and brokers, depending on the function they perform. Now, I've spent most of the last dozen years pursuing and interviewing various arms dealers. The worst of them, if I can put it like that, was a gentleman who'd never been interviewed before, who, when I first emailed him to ask him for an interview, he wrote back one line. In my long life, he was 77 at the time, I've never done anything for nothing. Why should I start now? After flattering him in emails every fortnight for over a year, I eventually got a call out of the blue to visit him at one of his 9 global offices, this one in Amman, Jordan, in which he told me over 6 and a bit hours of his over 5 decades in this industry, starting with his work for a company run by a former senior Nazi officer in post-war Germany in his late teens. The man is, to put it bluntly, an unreconstructed neo-Nazi. At one point, I said to him, "Do your sort of historical Nazi connections ever create problems for you?" He looked at me as though I wasn't at all intelligent and said, "Of course not. You know, I often talk to my clients how if only Hitler had been able to finish his work, we wouldn't have most of the problems we have in the world today." I didn't mention to him that my mother was a Holocaust survivor. Immediately after that, he pulled out his identity tags for his extensive work for the US Department of Defense in Iraq and Afghanistan, and showed me his appointment letter for his work for USAID, their aid agency, in those 2 countries, in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and various other parts of Africa. These people are often intelligence assets. They operate above the law. When there are arms embargoes, they just see dollar signs. An arms embargo for them is a premium on a deal because they can charge more for it, because they're supposedly running various legal risks. And corruption in this trade is not some unfortunate add-on to an otherwise healthy business. The trade in weapons accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all global trade. When the US Department of Commerce decided to do a study of 5 years of corrupt transactions involving American businesses, over 50% of them were in the defense business. And that corruption is built into the very structure, the very DNA of the trade. And the greatest problem is people like the arms dealer I interviewed, but also the executives of the large companies and those companies themselves, operate in something of a parallel legal universe. Of the 502 violations of UN arms embargoes that we recorded when we published the book, so there are probably more by now, 2 have resulted in any legal action whatsoever. 1 in a very mild conviction. Norman mentioned the Al-Yamamah deal in the 1980s between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, probably the most corrupt commercial transaction in history, in which, according to the Metropolitan Police International Anti-Corruption Unit, around £6 billion of commissions were paid. The vast majority of them, what you and I understand as bribes. Mark Thatcher received £12 million for his work as a fixer, making sure his mother was available when needed to iron out any problems in the deal. Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the then Saudi ambassador to the US and the son of the then Saudi defense minister, was paid over £1 billion. And in case that wasn't enough, BAE also gave him a birthday gift of an Airbus jet, painted in the colors of his favorite American football team, the Dallas Cowboys. I experienced this industry firsthand in South Africa, as has been referred to. I was an ANC Member of Parliament, initially under Nelson Mandela, and as Mandela was stepping down from public life, his successor, Thabo Mbeki, decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that our new democracy didn't need and is barely used to this day. On one of the biggest contracts, BAE didn't even make the technical shortlist. 3 of 9 companies did, because its product didn't meet certain of the technical specs, and it cost 2.5 times the aircraft that the South African Air Force actually wanted. So our defense minister, who benefited massively from this deal personally, decided to exclude cost as a procurement criteria on the biggest contract that the democratic South Africa has yet signed in its history. Half of the 24 trainer jets we bought from BAE Systems have never left the ground because we have no need for them. We don't have enough pilots to train on them, and we can't afford the fuel to fly. More important than that, and to give you just an inkling in the time that I have of the sorts of socio-economic and human rights impacts that this trade has. At the same time that we were spending $10 billion on weapons we didn't need, thanks to BAE's payment of 115 million pounds in bribes on their deal. Our President Thabo Mbeki said that the state could not afford to provide antiretroviral medication to the 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS at the time. The School of Public Health at Harvard has estimated conservatively that 365,000 South Africans died avoidable deaths in 5 years because of that decision. 54,000 babies were born HIV positive every year because we didn't have the money to provide the mother-to-child transmission treatment. But we had $10 billion to spend on that. So the next time somebody tells you that corruption is a victimless crime, please quote this example. Norman mentioned the settlement with BAE Systems, which was a disgrace to the justice system of the United Kingdom. The reparations that were paid to Tanzania were paid to the same government that had benefited from the $15 million of corruption in that deal. For a military air traffic radar for a country that didn't have an air force. And the reason Barclays Bank was being used was because it became the bank of choice for arms dealers and arms companies. Because Charles Taylor, the ruler of Liberia, who was responsible for the civil war in Sierra Leone, his brother happened to work for Barclays Bank at the time that Charles needed weapons. And that bank has remained the key financier of most major arms deals today. And the politician in Tanzania who benefited most, by the way, in terms of the corruption, later became head of the ruling party's ethics committee. You really couldn't make this stuff up, which is why there are almost 3,000 footnotes in this book, so that people understand that not a word of it is made up. I wish I could say that what I'm telling you about was historical and no longer happens. But currently, my organization, which is a little organization called Corruption Watch, is investigating 4 recent cases of illegality in arms deals, either by British companies or British subsidiaries of European companies. One of which includes a very worrying rising phenomenon in this country, which is the role of the UK in the trade in second-hand weaponry, and involves weaponry that was sold by Norway through a British front company, supposedly to the Nigerian government, who knew absolutely nothing about the transaction. Instead, it went to a Nigerian warlord. That company continues to operate, even though it doesn't have an office. All it has is a post office box. Continues to operate and is still registered at Companies House in the UK, even though this deal was brought to the attention of the relevant legal enforcement and government authorities in this country. The reality is, in conclusion, that if we simply accept the status quo of the arms trade as it currently functions, it will continue to make the world a poorer place, a less democratic place, a far more corrupt place, but perhaps most ironically of all, a far more dangerous place. Thanks very much.